Our last speaker is Dr. Jacob Erickson. Yeah, Dr. Jacob Erickson is an assistant. Okay, sorry. It's assistant professor of theological ethics in the School of Religion, Theology, and Peace Study at Trinity College, Dublin, and a director of undergraduate teaching and learning for this school, a constructive theologian, and a theological ethicist. Dr. Erickson writes to evoke an ecotheology of planetary conviviality, the playful and just cherishing of the life together. In the midst of current ecological crisis, ecological injustice, emerging perspective in the wake of global warming and the new challenge in energy production. In his writing, Dr. Erickson meditates on the complex relationship of Earth and divinity, decolonial environmental ethic, and queer theory, classical Christian and theology, and contemporary constructive theopoetics. He is currently working on an extended project on the intersection of global warming and theology called A Theopoetics of the Earth, Divinity in the Anthropocene, and finishing up a book on climate grief and theopeutic, forthcoming with Fortress Press. His vital work, Inquire Ecotheology, appear in meaningful flesh, reflection on religion and nature for a queer planet. The title of your paper is Epiphanic Ecologies, where they are poetic for planet in the process. Welcome, Dr. Erickson.
There are many people in this room in whose books I've uttered thank you late at night, and so now I begin in gratitude. Oh, hello. A little over 50 years ago, John Cobb published a book titled with an interrogative invitation that haunts us all. Is it too late? The question, I hope, is not perhaps posed as a sign of exhaustion at the end of a conference, nor is it posed to my body that thinks it's somewhere in the realm of 1 or 2 a.m. in Ireland still. It seems my paper has arrived too late, and the bodied words of this event, this occasion that might have constituted my writing differently, have perhaps already reshaped my own thinking and yours, to such an extent that my own gestures, written out of anticipation, might only serve to transgress the patience of your attention. Tough luck. Is it too late? Haven't we covered anything? Everything. What is a great week this has been, and I can't wait for what's next. It's too late for this, Jake, don't you know? No. The question, is it too late, posed urgently before my birth and hovering delicately over our collective futures, haunts here because it seems that despite so much bad news, so many ominous predictions, in many ways, many parts of society have consciously and unconsciously caught up to holding forth this very query. Extinctions, IPCC timelines, apocalyptic fictions, school sit-ins, and more. The question, is it too late, carries with it, for those who ask with seriousness, a kind of devastating incredulity. Is it too late? Asked with the sinking feeling in the pit of many of our stomachs that it is, in fact, a kind of despair might set its claws in, and there are some creatures and places, actions and inactions it is too late for. We know this in the tragedy of our living. The difference, however, is that Cobb's question seemed less about the scientific timelines and devastations of the present and more about the possibility of metanoia itself. Was it too late for a change of commitment on the part of theology in particular, but in all of us, for marshaling relational responsibility for our ecological context? Commitment implies a range of affective possibilities and dispositions: dedication, courage, attention, self-obligation, enactment, charge, and for the theologically inclined, devotion. Commitment is not merely a dedication to a description of the world or a logical alignment, but cultivated aesthetic and affective senses of orientations to the world, to the relationalities that constitute and exceed us. How do we form a conduit for the relational energies that make up you and me across time and space, in our bodies and in divinity, to participate in just forms of creative transformation? As Cobb wrote, critiquing hierarchical and anthropocentric stewardship models of ecological action, since we ourselves are part of nature, we can recognize that process working in ourselves, both in our bodies and in our personalities, as well as in our environment. We can develop sensitivity to that process, and by restraint and openness, assist its working both within and without. I am sensitive to the words deployed here for a potential ecological ethic, affective sensitivity to the process within, a play of restraint and openness for the sake of love and justice. We might call this a nimble environmental theology of attunement, where apophatic and intimate interplays of guardedness and reciprocity and receptivity go together and attempt a response or responsibility. Any attempt to respond or marshal a responsibility without affective transformation is futile. So many of the caustic processes that get essentialized in their nominalization need more textured flexibility and a sense of affective particularity: extinction, deforestation, acidification, pollution, as if they are one thing in their devastation. All are more many than their abstractions of name offer. In the time I have with you, I want to play with asking Cobb's question of commitment in two further ways. Firstly, a furthering of an affective range. Is it too late to, or perhaps even proper to, maybe an unlikely privilege, to mourn and take delight in the ecological ambiguity of our planetary contexts? Might we not feel guilty or overburdened in grieving loss and recognizing pleasure, sometimes in their messy intermingling, as a vital persuasive force for a kind of survival and resistance? Secondly, refracted in that first question, and just as pressing as, for me, renewed and very public political policy attacks on the dignity of LGBTQ+, and particularly trans folks, sweeps parts of the United States and Europe. In the last month, my home state, North Dakota, has passed over 20 bills when it hasn't touched a single one in the past. One might ask whether it is too late for new queer perspectives to nuance our effective political energies of grief and pleasure to meet the climate crisis both as a crisis of environmental history and a crisis of social solidarity. Put simply, can a queer poetics and a queer process theopoetics offer any wisdom for the climate movement navigating ecological loss? My conviction here is that queer ecology can begin to emerge between these two questions, and that it might offer theology or theopoetics or an artistic capacity for feeling through our collective planetary future. One might be struck by an epiphany of insight, relationality, and the unexpected possibilities of, as womanist theologians remind us, making a way out of no way. In the last few years, scholars in the environmental humanities have turned to ask questions of affect theory and the various phenomena of ecological grief, eco-anxiety, climate grief, apocalypse fatigue, and a range of ecological feelings associated with our current ecological devastations. I found these scholars incredibly helpful to think through the warp and woof of the feelings and emotions that occur in the wake of ecological injustice and climate colonialism. While some of these inquiries are sometimes associated with eco-psychology or pastoral care, we would be wrong to solely locate them as such. Somebody told me I was working on a pastoral care project, and I said, yeah, I guess so, maybe. They're political possibilities of feeling. How do feelings of ecological loss or the complex emotions associated with a sense of looming dread about our planet occur in cultural and political keys? And how do we engage in them and with creative transformation in mind? In a range of disciplines, scholars as varied as Joanna Macy, Ashley Kinsolo, and Neville Ellis, Leslie Davenport, Leslie Head, Sarah Jaquette Ray, Joshua Trey Barnett, Trebby Johnson, Glenn Albrecht, and others that haven't quite sort of marshaled into my process conversations yet, have published wide arrays of studies on ecological affect, politics, and the impact of what is variously called ecological or climate grief. Calls for papers and recent gatherings of the American Academy of Religion, including this coming one, now finally include this topic. Kinsolo and Ellis, based on their research with Inuit communities in Alaska, have offered a kind of definition and decolonial definition, I think, in Nature, in the magazine Nature, where ecological grief is, quote, the grief felt in relation to experienced or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to the acute or chronic environmental change. Grief holds within its vision losses of species, losses of cultural practices and memory, displacement, fears of losses to come, and more. Kinsolo and Ellis's definition illumines and intersects themes of process thought with remarkable resonance, felt relation, the back and forth of experience and anticipation, meaningful value. In her important article, Working Through Environmental Despair, poet Joanna Macy taps through into those resonances in different ways, noting that ecological despair and grief cannot be ignored or gotten over, but must be worked through in riding the wave. What we are really dealing with here, she writes, is akin to the original meaning of compassion, suffering with. It is the distress we feel in connection to the larger whole of which we are a part. It is our pain for the world. Instead of seeing the parts and wholes as constitutive, disconnected, it's Macy's observation of the withness of grieving, the environmental despair, that it's not only about what we actively bear witness to from a distance, but the real shifting and tumbling entangled webs of relation that pull at and in our bodies and hearts. The importance of grieving ecologically is that it is an art of feeling through the textured impacts of a potential metaphysics. It's about recognizing that the grief in our bones is the grief of an ecosystem. The feeling of loss is bound up in a relational pleasure of connection, the desire for what is lost. In his 2022 book, Mourning in the Anthropocene, Joshua Trey Barnett notes that the effective turn in eco-criticism in ecological grief research usually appeals to two general principles. Firstly, Barnett observes that scholars in this area note a, quote, awareness of knowledge, note that an awareness of knowledge of environmental and planetary crises alone does not guarantee that one will work to mitigate the disasters about which one has learned. Goes to the point I remember Gus Speth saying this to us at Yale as well, that was said earlier. Barnett refers here wisely to the insights gleaned from scholars of climate communication that simply spouting facts about climate change to people doesn't change their minds or urgency or invite them into participation and transformation. Scholars of religion and ecology might say, yeah, finally, people are catching up. Connecting emotional awareness and the conviction of value lures responses and responsibilities on with a wise sense of urgency. Secondly, Barnett argues that in a statement that sounds like a potential oversimplification, different feelings move us in different directions towards distinctive values, thoughts, and inclinations, maybe a lure for feeling. Thinking about the movement of feeling is not an act of reductive calculus, I would argue, but to echo earlier words from Cobb, recognizing the process within ourselves. Here Barnett asks me what is a crucial question. How, though, he writes, do people become capable of mourning ecological losses and earthly transformations? What fosters the capabilities or capacities of sensitivity, of attention, and tapping into potential chaotic transformations of earthly life in our present moment for the sake of justice, resilience, resistance, and political possibility? The question is crucial for Barnett in that the capacity to mourn beyond the human is linked to the capacity, indeed the desire and willingness to undertake the difficult and yet necessary work of maintaining conditions of earthly coexistence. Whereas many think of grief as simply an uncomplicatedly passive emotion, it's anything but. It navigates complicated dances of power, cultural context, and it might be attended to, felt, navigated, avoided, redirected. Grief is not an ontological state of being, I am in grief. It is sometimes a fraught navigation of relational intensities. Political geographer Leslie Head cautions that thinking about ecological grief might be an expression of a kind of anxiety about the loss of Western imperial power. I'm feeling ecological grief because I can't live the way that I have for the last few years. Sarah Jaquette Ray critiques approaches to climate anxiety in her own field guide and cautions another really important point, that it seems to be an overwhelmingly white phenomenon. She writes that exhaustion, anger, hope, the effects of oppression and resistance are not unique to this climate moment. What is unique is that people who have been insulated from oppression are now waking up to the prospect of their own unlivable future. And any asked question of whether it is too late must reckon with the historical question that it has been too late for many, time and time again. Given all that I've said so far about ecological grief, what strikes me is the powerful, creative, and unexpected ways that queer scholars in particular are thinking about the politics of grief for a livable future. Excuse me. Queer theorist Judith Butler has wrestled with, in their definitions of precarious life, grief and grievance, grievability, and what counts as grievable in society. As Butler observes, an ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it has never lived, that it has never counted as life at all. Ungrievable lives suppressed from various viewpoints of anthropocentrisms, androcentrisms, white supremacies, heterosexisms, cissexisms, reflect a variety of political priorities. And relearning to grieve is a process of compassionately challenging the false sovereignties of in ourselves, our unacknowledged griefs, and the political marginalization of things that should be grieved for. It's urgent, requiring the urgency of immediacy for the sake of transformation, and it's urgent, requiring a slow kind of attention. The contradictory experience of that is definite. In her article, Aesthetics of Loss, critical geographer Catherine Youssef frames the possibility of grieving in this way. Sadness is the uncovering of a tie of interdependence. Transforming the sadness into a resource for politics involves then an engagement with the exuberance of presence and practices of care, and an engagement with the ways in which violence is sutured in all sorts of banal and catastrophic ways into community relations. What I'm not arguing for here is a kind of mass lamentation, weeping in the streets, crying in every public gathering, or an intensification of feelings of loss for every minute creature and companion that would be impossible and possibly apocalyptic, and a drive towards a certain kind of sovereignty. I can grieve everything. But a sense of textured locatedness. And I'm not doing an altar call trip. I'm Lutheran, we don't know how to do those. And I'm not offering here a kind of morose pessimism or cynicism, asking us to focus solely on the negativity. Grief in its complicatedness, noted by many gay liberation theologians, it is frequently responded to with nuanced practices of play and eroticism, drag, performativity, mocking, humor, ashes actions, glitter bombs, and folks like Nicole Seymour, one of my colleagues who works in queer ecology, has a whole new book on glitter and the difficulties of plastic and queer politics. It's quite really remarkable. In queer perspective, ecological grief could rightly be viewed as a practice of failure. We fail to grieve only for what society expects us to grieve for. We can grieve for other creatures, our context. We can hold funerals for glaciers, processions that remember extinctions, and the proverbial child who holds a funeral for a baby robin they found in the yard. And we can direct public acts of care in unexpected ways that might look carnivalesque from the outside. Not just a joke, and not just serious academic or disciplinary work, but deep attentiveness, acknowledging absurdities and ironies in our context and losses. In a kind of summary, how might we proceed? And I've been struck lately by uncommon writers who've turned to contemplative and apophatic mystical traditions, with using the language of epiphany and contemplative undoing, revealing creaturely relationality. Classical epiphanies and theophanies, the burning bush, the silence of Horeb, transfiguration, holding the conflicting realities of loss and possibility together. The bush, enslavement and liberation, silence, the absence of divinity and its lurid prophetic work, transfiguration, an inheritance of the past and the risk of the future. The relationality of earth, divinity, and human provocation. One might recognize the vitality anew approaching ecological grief through practices of a fiercely contemplative political desire that may illumine the multiplicity of ecological relationality, flows of loss and desire, creaturely entanglements of earth and divine. My own attention with Whitehead and Judith Butler still in view has turned lately in this regard to the writings of the mid-20th century botanist, plant morphologist, and apophatic theology-obsessed Agnes Arber. I've been calling her Triple A. In the 1950s, Arber turned to what biologists fear was a turn far out of left field, that they didn't recognize her anymore. From her writing on herbals and grains, water plants, and other plant philosophy, to mysticism and apophatic theology. Her books progressed from a classical text on grasses to the natural philosophy of plant form to a contemplative methodological guide, The Mind and the Eye, and to her final book, A Wrestling with Mystics and Apophatic Theology, somewhat abandoning plants altogether, called The Manifold and the One in 1957. Cambridge Press, her usual publisher, rejected the final book, fearing it too academic. They didn't know what to do with the mysticism of it. Whereas biologists see Arber getting more and more obscure in her task, it's actually a cultivated apophatic trajectory in her writing. Plants in contemplative observation unsay themselves, growing, reaching, forming, and unforming over time, constantly referring back to their ecological contexts. If you know the images in classical botany books of the image of a plant as the sort of typological form, they can't actually depict the plant as it is. They have to depict entire life cycles of it and possible roots and shoots, such that even trying to draw a picture of a plant unsays itself in its own context. For Arber, and some coming to a conclusion, for Arber, it meant that a kind of unsaying mysticism and recognizing a cosmology where the oneness of contemplation is always a manifold. She would write that we may be, by working with false dualisms and ignoring the ecological messy context of creatures, and we may, by pursuing it, come to know not merely as a static dictum, but as a winged intuition carrying the infinitude of significance both in mind and heart, that the one is the manifold and the manifold is the one. One might, yeah, sorry, I'm going a little on here. One might approach holy ground, where in a garden or a plant, after a night of partying or a conference like this with friends, we might ask various cups to be taken from us. We might imagine queer ways of earth bearing witness to ourselves and to our loves. In one version of contemporary Gethsemane, as Mary Oliver writes, the other creatures bore witness to us. Jesus said, "Wait with me," and maybe the stars did. Maybe the wind wound itself into a silver tree and didn't move. Maybe the lake far away, where he once walked on it as a blue pavement, lay still and waited, wide awake. That contemplative practice of mysticism unsays our context, pays attention to the messy losses always ongoing and in place, and redirects our attention to the ways that others are bearing witness to our losses as well. Thanks.